Betty's true story from Georgia. When her DIL locked her out, she took back control. There are certain kinds of silence that feel louder than any argument, and Betty Morrison learned that the hard way the morning she found her own front door bolted from the inside, her suitcase sitting on the porch like a discarded thing. Betty had spent 37 years in the same house in rural Georgia, raising her children, burying her husband, and keeping a garden that bloomed every spring without fail. She never imagined that at 72, the greatest battle of her life wouldn't come from illness or grief, but from the woman her only son married. This is a story about boundaries, family loyalty, the quiet violence of being erased from your own life, and how one grandmother found the courage to reclaim her dignity. The house on Maple Ridge Road was never fancy. It was a 3-bedroom brick ranch with a wraparound porch that Earl Morrison built with his own hands back in 1982. Every room carried something of him, the uneven tile in the kitchen where he'd miscounted the spacing, the doorframe in the hallway where he'd marked Marcus's height every birthday until the boy turned 18, the creaking third step on the back porch that Earl always said he'd fix next summer. He never did, and after he passed from a stroke at 66, Betty never fixed it either. She liked the sound. It reminded her he'd been real. Betty retired from teaching 4th grade at Ridgeview Elementary after 31 years. The whole town knew her. She was the woman who brought peach cobbler to every funeral, who sang alto in the Mount Zion Baptist Church choir every Sunday without missing a note, who still wrote thank you cards by hand on cream-colored stationery. Her life was small by some measures, but it was full. It was hers. Marcus was her only surviving child. Her daughter Angela had died in a car accident at 19. Grief Betty carried like a stone in her chest that never dissolved, only grew smoother with time. So Marcus became everything, not in an unhealthy way, not in the way people sometimes mean when they say a mother is too close to her son, but in the way that happens naturally when loss narrows your world and one person becomes the living proof that your life meant something. Marcus moved to Atlanta after college, took a job in logistics, built a quiet career. He was a good mangental, steady, the kind who remembered to call every Sunday evening and never forgot her birthday. But he was also conflict avoidant in a way that Betty recognized came from growing up in a house touched by grief. He'd learned early that keeping the peace mattered more than speaking up. As a boy, that made him easy to raise. As a man, it would cost him something he didn't yet understand. He married Diane when he was 38. She was sharp, ambitious, pretty in a polished way that Betty noticed immediately, the kind of woman who always looked like she was about to chair a meeting. Betty tried to love her. She truly did. At the wedding, she held Diane's hands and said, "Welcome to this family," and she meant every word. But the signs were there from the beginning, quiet as a whisper. You almost convince yourself you didn't hear. Diane's first visit to Maple Ridge Road lasted only 2 days, and on the second morning, she looked around the kitchen and said, "This is all very vintage, isn't it?" with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She rearranged the holiday schedule so that Thanksgiving and Christmas rotated to her parents' home 2 years running. She suggested Marcus cut his Sunday calls to bi-weekly because they were always in the middle of something. Small things. Things that, taken alone, meant nothing. But together they formed a pattern Betty could feel, even when she couldn't name it, a slow, deliberate thinning of the thread between mother and son. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of warm Georgia evening where the crickets sing so loud you have to close the windows to hear the television. Marcus's voice was careful, the way it got when he was asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved to ask. "Mama, our house needs foundation work. They're saying 3 months minimum, maybe longer. Diane and the kids were wondering if maybe they could stay with you while I finish out a work contract in the city. I'd come down on weekends." Betty didn't hesitate, not for 1 second. Because family is family, and that house had always been big enough for love, and those grandbaby Sasaya, 5, and little Clara, barely 3, she would have moved mountains just to hear their laughter in those hallways again. "Of course," she said. "This is your home too. It always will be." She didn't know, as she hung up the phone and started planning which room to prepare for the children, that she had just opened her door to something she would spend the next year fighting to survive. What began as a temporary arrangement 6 weeks, maybe 8, would stretch into something Betty never consented to. And by the time she realized what was happening, the locks on her own doors had already been changed. The first week wasn't terrible. That's what Betty would tell herself later, that it started soft, started reasonable, started in a way that made her feel like maybe she was the one being too rigid. Diane arrived with the children on a Tuesday afternoon. 2 suitcases and a portable crib and a smile that seemed friendly enough. Betty had prepared the guest room, put fresh flowers on the nightstand, bought the cereal Isaiah liked. And for those first few days, it was simply awkward, the kind of awkward that comes when adults who don't know each other well share a kitchen and a bathroom schedule. Betty adjusted. She started her morning coffee earlier, so she'd be out of the kitchen before Diane came down. She kept the television low. She offered to watch the kids whenever Diane needed a break. She was genuinely trying to be the kind of mother-in-law who made things easier. But here is what Betty didn't understand yet. When you are the one making every adjustment, every compromise, every accommodation, and the other person is making known that is not harmony. That is surrender dressed up as hospitality. It started with the kitchen. Diane rearranged the spice cabinet one afternoon while Betty was out, moved everything into a new order that made no sense to hands that had reached for paprika in the same spot for 30 years. Betty noticed, felt irritation, and said nothing. Then the newspaper. Betty had subscribed to the Macon Telegraph for as long as she could remember the crossword, the obituaries. One morning it wasn't on the porch. "I canceled it," Diane said casually. $40 a month for something you can read online? That's wasteful, Betty. As if she hadn't just made a decision about another woman's money without asking. Then the visitors. Lorraine from church came by on a Thursday, and Diane met her at the door with Clara on her hip. "The kids are about to nap. We need it quiet today." "Maybe another time?" Lorraine left confused. Betty made excuses for Diane, because that is what gracious women do. They explain away the behavior of people who are slowly taking everything from them. Week by week, Betty's reading chair moved to her bedroom because the playpen needed that spot. Her African violets relocated to the back porch because Clara might pull them down. The thermostat lowered from 72 to 68 because the kids sleep better cool. Each change small enough to seem reasonable alone. Each change another centimeter of ground lost, Betty tried to address it directly. The first time, Diane's eyes filled with tears. "I'm just trying to make this work for everyone." The second time, deflection. "You should have said something sooner." The third time, something harder. "Maybe if you were a little more flexible, this wouldn't be so stressful for all of us." Betty called Marcus. "Just be patient, Mama," he said. "Diane's under a lot of pressure. Give her time to adjust. Give her time. Give her space. Give her grace." No one asked what Betty was losing in all that giving. The toll crept in like cold under a door in winter. Betty stopped sleeping through the night. She stopped tending her garden. What was the point? When her tomato cages had been moved for a plastic slide, she started spending entire days in her bedroom, reading the same page over and over. Lorraine noticed. "Betty, you haven't been yourself in weeks. What's going on in that house?" Betty opened her mouth to answer, but shame stopped her. "Because how do you explain that you've been asking permission to use your own kitchen? How do you admit that you knocked on your own living room door last Tuesday? Actually knocked before entering, because you didn't want to be told you were being intrusive." That moment stayed with her like a stone in her chest. She had knocked on a door inside her own home paid for with 40 years of work and mortgage payments made on time, even when money was tight. She had knocked like a guest, like someone who didn't belong. This is how it happens. Not with a single dramatic blow, but with 100 small cuts, each so minor that pointing it out feels petty. Politeness becomes a cage. The desire to keep peace becomes a willingness to disappear. And the adult child caught in the middle becomes not a mediator, but an accomplice, enabling the very behavior, hollowing his mother out from the inside. But the morning Betty woke up to find the front door deadbolt changed a new lock. She didn't have a key to something inside her, shifted permanently. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning where Georgia air still holds a trace of summer warmth, but the light has shifted towards something thinner. Betty had taken her usual walk down to the mailbox around the block, past the magnolia tree Earl planted the year Marcus was born. She liked these mornings. They were hers. For 20 minutes she could pretend nothing inside her house had changed. She came up the porch steps reaching into her housecoat pocket for her keys. The brass one, carried for 31 years, slid into the deadbolt as always. But it didn't turn. She tried again, thinking maybe her fingers were stiff from the chill. The key was right. The lock was wrong. Betty stood on her own front porch, holding a key that no longer opened her own front door, and for a moment the world went very still. She knocked. She stood there and knocked on the door of the house her husband built with lumber he'd personally selected from the yard on Highway 41. 1 minute, 2, 3. She could hear movement inside footsteps, the television, a coffee mug set down. Finally, Diane opened the door, hair still wrapped, wearing the silk robe that had appeared in the bathroom shortly after she moved in. "Oh, Betty," she said, as if mildly surprised to find her mother-in-law on her own porch. Marcus had the locks updated, security reasons. She produced a single key from the entryway drawer, holding it out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This one's for the back door. We figured that'd be easier for you since you come through the garden most mornings." Then she said the words that would echo in Betty's mind for weeks. "The front door is really just for the family entrance now, you understand. Family. As though Betty were not the woman who raised the man sleeping upstairs. as though she had not washed these floors on her knees, painted these walls, held her husband's hand in that living room as he took his last breaths. Family entrance, and she was handed the back door key like hired help. Betty did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Diane for a long, quiet moment, took the key, and walked to the backyard. There was a bench there, simple pine, slightly weathered. Earl built it the summer before he got sick, placed it under the crepe myrtle so Betty could watch the birds. She sat down and felt something move inside her chestnut breaking, something hardening, something deciding. She had tolerated the redecorating, being asked to keep to her room when Diane's friends visited, knocking on doors inside her own house. But she would not enter her home through the back door. That was the line, and Diane had crossed it with a smile. Betty called Marcus. He answered on the fourth ring, voice groggy. She told him plainly what happened. A long pause. Then, stammering, didn't know about the lock change. He'd talked to Diane, probably a misunderstanding. When he finished, she spoke without tremor. Marcus, this is my house. Your father built it with his hands. I will not enter my own home through the back door like a stranger. The silence that followed told her everything. It was not the silence of a man preparing to fight for his mother. It was the silence of a man who had already chosen a side and couldn't say so aloud. She hung up without goodbye. That afternoon she called Lorraine, who listened without interrupting, then gave her the number of a legal aid clinic downtown. Betty called the next morning. A young woman named Keisha pulled the property records and confirmed what Betty suspected, but never verified. The house was in her name alone. Earl had put the deed solely in Betty's name when they refinanced in 1996. It had never been altered. Diane and Marcus had no legal claim. None. That knowledge settled into Betty like bedrock. She had spent months feeling like a guest in her own life, shrinking to avoid conflict. But the law was clear. The house was hers. Every door front, back and side was hers. There is a particular grief that comes with this kind of turning point. Not loss exactly, but recognition. Betty sat with the truth that her only child had watched her be diminished and done nothing. Standing up for herself meant accepting that the person who should have defended her had chosen comfort over courage, his wife's approval over his mother's dignity. That grief doesn't disappear. You learn to carry it differently. But beneath it, something else was growing, not anger exactly, something quieter and more dangerous, resolve, the understanding that no one was coming to rescue her, and she did not need rescuing. She needed a plan. Armed with clarity and legal truth, Betty began doing something she had never done. In 72 years, she made a plan that put herself first. The first thing Betty did was call a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled Earl's will, someone new, someone who wouldn't soften the truth with sentiment. She found Patricia Haynes through a friend from church and sat in that office with her hands folded, telling the whole story plainly. Patricia listened, then asked one question. Is there any lease agreement? Any written arrangement about rent or shared expenses? There was nothing. No lease, no rental agreement, no formal arrangement of any kind. Just a mother who'd opened her door and a daughter-in-law who'd claimed everything on the other side. Patricia explained it clearly. As sole owner, Betty had full authority over who resided there. Georgia law afforded basic tenant protections. They couldn't be thrown out overnight, but with proper written notice, 30 days, Betty could legally require them to leave. After 18 months of silence in her own hallway, 30 days felt like both an eternity and a mercy. Betty filed the notice on a Tuesday morning, delivered formally, because Patricia said that mattered. Diane's reaction came in waves. First fury doors slamming, voice raised for the neighbors to hear. Then tears, sudden softness. "Betty, I thought we were family." Then the phone calls. Marcus called within the hour, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, you can't do this to my kids. You're putting your grandchildren on the street." Betty's hands trembled as she held that phone, but her voice was steady. "I'm not doing this to your children, Marcus. I'm doing this for myself. You are welcome to visit any time as guests. But this is my home, and I will live in it as its owner, not its prisoner." The silence stretched long, then quietly, "Mama," she said, "I love you, baby, but love cannot mean disappearing." The 30 days that followed were some of the hardest of Betty's life. Diane oscillated between silent hostility dishes left unwashed, doors closing too hard and unsettling sweetness, appearing with coffee, testing whether kindness could undo what the law had set in motion. Betty accepted the coffee. She was not cruel, but she did not waver. Marcus came by twice, looking haggard, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with sleeplessness. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd done homework as a boy and said little. Betty could see the war in him-torn loyalty, guilt, the dawning understanding that he'd allowed something to go terribly wrong. She didn't press. She simply existed in her truth and let him sit with his. But she made sure her grandchildren felt none of it. Every evening she could, she read them stories, cooked their favorites, held them close, and told them Grandma loved them bigger than the sky. Whatever was breaking between the adults, she refused to let it touch those children. On the 30th day, Diane loaded the car in silence. She did not say goodbye. She buckled the children in and stared ahead. But Marcus lingered in the doorway, same one, where Earl used to call him in for supper, and looked at his mother with eyes that held everything he couldn't say. He stepped forward and pulled her into a hug, tight, the kind that holds an apology and a grief all at once. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said, voice cracking. Betty held her son, breathed him in the way she had when he was small. "I know," she said, "but sorry has to come with change, baby. You hear me? Sorry has to come with change." He nodded against her shoulder, then let go, walked to the car, and they drove away. Betty watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner on Maple. Then she went inside. She changed the locks back to the brass originals Earl had installed when they first moved in. She found his wind chimes in the Gara GT1s Diane had taken down and hung them on the porch hook where they'd always been. The breeze caught them immediately, and the sound was like a voice she'd been missing. She sat in her rocking chair on that front porch for the first time in months. The evening was warm. The wind chimes sang. The quiet surrounding her was not absence or suppression. It was ownership, peace that had been earned. But reclaiming her house was only the beginning. The harder work rebuilding the relationship with her son, understanding what had gone wrong, learning to trust again, would take much longer. The first 3 months after the eviction were defined by silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the silence between people who understand each other so well that words become unnecessary. This was the heavy silence of things unsaid, of wounds still bleeding beneath the surface. Marcus called occasionally, maybe once every 2 weeks. The conversations were brief, careful, like two people walking across a frozen lake, unsure which step might crack the ice beneath them. "How are you, Mama?" "I'm fine, baby. How are the kids?" "They're good, growing fast." And then nothing. A pause that stretched too long, filled with everything neither of them was ready to say. Betty would hang up the phone and sit with her hands in her lap, feeling the ache of a son who was right there and yet somehow unreachable. Then she heard through her granddaughter's school through, a teacher she'd known for 15 years, that Diane had been telling people Betty kicked her grandchildren out onto the street, that she'd chosen property over family, that she was a cold, selfish woman who cared more about a house than about her own blood. The pain of that was different from anything Betty had felt before. It wasn't sharp, it was deep, a bone bruise kind of pain. Because Betty knew who she was. She knew what she'd done and why. But hearing your name reshaped in someone else's mouth, twisted into a story that bears no resemblance to the truth, that tests something in you. It tests whether your identity is built on what others say or on what you know. Betty made a decision in that moment that would define her recovery. She refused to fight back publicly. She refused to call people and correct the record, refused to post on social media, refused to gather allies and wage a campaign of reputation. She simply continued being who she had always been. She showed up at church. She waved to neighbors. She brought pie to the school bake sale. And slowly, the people who knew her, who had known her for decades, they understood. Character built over a lifetime cannot be undone by one person's narrative. The turning point came on a Saturday in late autumn. Marcus drove up alone. No Diane, no children. Just him in his work truck, pulling into the driveway the way he used to when he was 19, and coming home from his first real job. Betty watched him from the kitchen window. She didn't rush to the door. She let him come to her. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table, where he'd eaten cereal before school, where he'd done his homework, where Earl had taught him to play checkers. And he talked, really talked. For the first time in years, Marcus opened up about what was happening in his marriage. He admitted that Diane's behavior hadn't started with Betty. It had been escalating for years. The control, the manipulation, the way she isolated him from people who loved him. He'd started counseling 3 weeks after the eviction. He was beginning to see patterns he'd been blind to. Patterns that had nothing to do with his mother and everything to do with dynamics he'd never been taught to recognize. Betty listened. She listened more than she spoke, because she understood something that many parents never learn. There are moments when your child needs a mother, needs comfort and reassurance and unconditional love. And there are moments when they need a mirror, someone who simply reflects reality back without distortion. That Saturday, Marcus needed a mirror. He needed to hear himself say the truth out loud in a safe place. From that conversation, they built new ground rules. Marcus was always welcome. Always. That was non-negotiable. Diane was welcome too, but only when she could respect Betty's home and Betty's authority within it. No more rearranging. No more undermining. No more treating Betty like a guest in her own life. The grandchildren would visit regularly, because Betty's quarrel had never been with them. She made that clear with fierce tenderness. Those babies had done nothing wrong, and they would never be made to feel caught in the middle. Betty's personal healing unfolded quietly but deliberately. She returned to the church choir she'd stopped attending. She restarted her garden pulling weeds, turning soil, planting seeds that would bloom in spring. She called friends she'd isolated from during those dark months, and she let them back in. Eventually, she began volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. She didn't give speeches. She simply sat with women who were being made small in their own lives by husbands, by in-laws, by systems designed to keep them silent, and she shared her story, not as a triumph, as a truth, and those women heard themselves in her words. Here is what Betty will tell you if you ask. Diane never apologized, not once, not in the months that followed, not in the year after. And Betty accepted this. She did not chase an apology or manufacture closure. She understood that not every story ends with a neat resolution. Some fractures remain. Some people never see what they've done. The mature response is not to force healing where it cannot grow, but to protect your peace while leaving a door open. Not the back door, the front door, on your own terms, in your own time. Betty's story isn't just a story about a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It's a story about something much larger something. Every person who has ever loved someone within a family needs to understand. So what can we carry with us from Betty's journey? What truths did she uncover in the wreckage of that painful seasoned truths that belong not just to her, but to anyone who has ever felt erased within the walls of their own family? The first lesson is perhaps the hardest to accept because it contradicts everything many of us were taught. Boundaries are not acts of war. They are acts of self-preservation. Betty will tell you plainly that her deepest regret was not the confrontation itself, but the years she spent avoiding it. She confused tolerance with love. She believed that enduring mistreatment without complaint was proof of her devotion as a mother, as a family member, as a good woman, and she is not alone in this. Entire generations of women were raised to believe that their worth was measured by how much they could absorb without breaking. But there is nothing virtuous about disappearing. There is nothing noble about allowing someone to strip you of dignity in your own home and calling it patience. Whether the conflict is with an in-law, an adult child, a step-family member, or a spousey principle holds. The moment you recognize that your silence is being used as permission, that is the moment a boundary becomes necessary, not as punishment, as protection. The second lesson belongs to Marcus and to every person who has ever stood in the middle of a family conflict and chosen stillness over action. When an adult child refuses to address their spouse's harmful behavior toward their parent, they are not keeping the peace. They are choosing a side through inaction. Marcus believed that staying neutral was the loving choice. He thought that by not engaging, he was preventing escalation. But what he was actually doing was leaving his mother alone in a battle she never asked for. The most vulnerable person in any family dynamic is often the one who loves too much to fight and has too much pride to beg. Conflict avoidance in marriage is seductive because it feels like wisdom. But when your avoidance costs someone else their home, their peace, their sense of belonging, it is not wisdom. It is cowardice dressed in gentle language. Marcus eventually began to understand this. It took time. It took watching his mother rebuild her life without him at the center, and to his credit, he chose growth over defensiveness. But the lesson remains. Courage in family is not the absence of discomfort. It is the willingness to have the hard conversation before the damage becomes irreversible. The third lesson is practical, and Betty wants every person listening to hear it clearly. Know your legal and practical standing. Her turning point did not come from an emotional breakthrough alone. It came from information. When Betty learned that she had legal authority over her own property, that her name on the deed was not merely symbolic, something shifted in her spine. She went from feeling like a guest to remembering she was the owner. So many elderly people, and particularly women, move through conflict without ever understanding their rights. They don't know what the law says about property, tenancy, financial autonomy. They assume that because someone else speaks louder or moves faster, they must have more power. This is not a call to weaponize the law against your family. It is an invitation to stand on solid ground. You cannot advocate for yourself if you do not know what you are entitled to. Knowledge is not aggression. It is foundation. The fourth lesson is the one that separates bitterness from healing. Reclaiming control does not mean destroying love. Betty never stopped loving Marcus. She never turned her grandchildren into pawns. She never stood in the doorway of that house and declared victory over her son's marriage. What she did was far more difficult. She separated the behavior from the person. She addressed the behavior with firmness and clarity, while holding space for the person she still loved. This is the most important and most misunderstood skill in family conflict. The world tells us that strength looks like severing, that power looks like punishment. But Betty understood that revenge fantasies, however satisfying they feel in the dark hours of the night, do not build anything worth living in. Resolution requires restraint, firmness without cruelty, clarity without vindictiveness. And the final lesson is this: your home, both the physical walls and the emotional space you inhabit, is sacred. No one has the right to make you feel like a stranger in your own life. Whether it is a literal house or your sense of identity, your autonomy, your peace, you are allowed to protect it. Months later, Betty sat across from a young woman at the shelter. A woman half her age with that same look in her eyes, that mix of exhaustion and disbelief. And Betty took her hand and said something she now repeats like a quiet prayer. "Baby, don't wait until they change the locks." The moment someone makes you feel like you don't belong in your own story, that's when you stand up. Not with anger, with truth. And perhaps that is what Betty's story ultimately teaches us. That true family is not built on possession or control. It is built on mutual respect, freely given and firmly expected. And protecting yourself, drawing that sacred line, does not diminish your capacity to love. It is, in fact, the very thing that keeps love possible.